Hello, everyone. So as you can see, the title and focus of my presentation is on achieving nutrient adequacy while staying within planetary boundaries. And given that I work for a development organization that's primarily based in the Global South, I'm really going to try to bring up some of the low-income country perspectives as well, which contrast with some of what we've heard this morning and during this session, so hopefully also stimulate some nice debate at the end. Okay. I'm going to skip through some of the first introductory slides because we heard a lot about it during the morning session if you were here in the nutrition strand, and probably most of you are familiar with these figures and numbers anyways. So most of my work focuses on nutrient adequacy and specifically micronutrient adequacy and its nexus and intersection with environmental concerns about food systems. So how can we achieve both goals, not wretching the environment while at the same time nourishing people on this planet? We've seen this graph in the morning, so again, I'm going to skip through this. But this is just to say that all of us are aware that we're facing a huge dual global challenge. We need to feed over 8 billion people currently and an expected 10 billion by 2050. And at the same, and we need to do it well, not just feed them, but actually nourish them with everything they need. And at the same time, we also need to stay within planetary boundaries. And as you can see, it's pretty evident that we're not doing great in that regard. 6 out of the 9 boundaries were already transpassed as of 2023. So this is basically unprecedented disruption of the Earth system where we live. These are some of the key high-level stats from recent reports and publications on the prevalence of the double burden of malnutrition. I'm sure that all of the people in this room are perfectly aware of them, but we're facing a dual pandemic, I think we can call it that way. On the one hand, overweight and obesity and non-communicable diseases, and on the other hand, undernutrition, including hidden hunger, which are still very prevalent, and not just in the Global South, as some might think. Again, these are stats that we've already seen in the morning, that the large contribution of food systems to environmental degradation worldwide. We know that they're responsible for a large proportion of greenhouse gas emissions, as well as water pollution and biodiversity loss through land use change, freshwater withdrawals, so water scarcity, and so on and so forth. So now I'm going to move on to the core of my presentation and hopefully present some of our studies and new data as well. So what is the role that global diets can play in addressing this dual global challenge? Well, we've already heard that global diets can serve as a key lever for addressing both challenges. On the one hand, diets are modifiable, which means that they're actually a factor we can act upon and we can have control over, unlike other unmodifiable fixed factors. On the other hand, they offer several entry points for policy making and for interventions. So it's also a concrete element that we can strategize over and act upon. And finally, they obviously have significant impacts, not just on human health, but also on environmental health. So they represent a key lever because they impact both. However, optimizing diets and coming up with ideal dietary shifts is an extremely complex problem that requires really careful strategizing. And why is that? On the one hand, we hear all the time, we've heard it a lot today, and I fully agree with it, that we need to switch to more plant-based, plant-forward diets, vegan, vegetarian, flexitarian, and the more the better. On the other hand, though, we have already heard today that these carry some risks of nutritional inadequacies. They may be unacceptable in many cultural contexts worldwide. I was recently in Tanzania and talking to some local communities as well. And what we've heard from many local communities and indigenous tribes that we work with is that swapping out animal source foods from their diets completely would be absolutely unacceptable. They looked at us as aliens when we proposed that. So cultural acceptability is an important factor. Another important factor is affordability. There are some recent large-scale global modeling studies that demonstrated that while plant-based diets would be more affordable in many global north countries, they would actually be less affordable in many countries in the global south. We're talking about a reduction in affordability of 18 to 29%, according to recent FAO estimates, and that is a big problem. So what do? Do we promote animal source foods consumption then? Well, no, not exactly, because we know that animal source foods are the largest contributors to greenhouse gas emissions and many other environmental impacts. So there's a lot of trade-offs here. That is my whole point and the point of this slide, that we need to carefully consider when coming up with optimization strategies for dietary shifts. We cannot go with a one-size-fits-all solution. We need to be really context-specific and targeting the populations and countries that we're working in. And we also need to we need to keep a holistic mindset and perspective and consider all of the aspects that have to do with dietary shifts, not just environment or nutrition. So the rest of my presentation, as you're going to see, is going to try to really make this point, the need for context-specific solutions, holistic solutions that address trade-offs and leverage synergies. This is one of the most recent and probably largest and most comprehensive analysis of the global burden of heat and hunger, which was led by my organization. I was involved in it together with many of my colleagues and many partners across the globe. What we did was to analyze dietary intakes across 180 countries globally, and we found that very strikingly, more than half of the global population has inadequate intakes of at least one essential micronutrient, very often more than one. So we're talking about 5 billion people that have inadequacies in, for example, iodine, vitamin E, calcium. We're talking about 4 billion that do not eat sufficient iron, riboflavin, folate, vitamin C, and there's many others that are listed here in the maps that I'm showing on the right side of the slide. So as you can see, the red, the orange, and the yellow are not just in the global south, they're also in the global north, which means that inadequacies are not just an LMIC problem, but they're also a problem that we face in-house in our countries. Oh, sorry. Obviously, the burden is not the same everywhere. It varies a lot by geographies. It varies a lot by population subgroups. What we observed in our analysis that actually South Asia is the region globally that has the highest risk of inadequacies across most of the nutrients that we looked at. Closely followed by Sub-Saharan Africa, by East Asia and the Pacific, but South Asia really came up as like strikingly the #1 in terms of risks across multiple micronutrients. Women and men have different risks. This depends on many factors. If you're interested, I'm happy to address that question afterwards. But we observed that, for example, women have more chances of having inadequate intakes in vitamin B12 and iron, whereas men, for example, have more chances of having inadequate intakes in magnesium, zinc, and various vitamins, thiamine, niacin, etc. This is the link to the Shiny app that Gain built, where you can see what is the prevalence of inadequate intakes across the globe, basically at national level and subnational level by age sex groups. So if you're curious, you can go and browse and see how your country is doing. So this is really an overarching global perspective that focuses on the general population. What happens when we narrow down the scope to vulnerable groups and we look at children and women? This analysis did not look at other vulnerable groups, so little disclaimer there. We did not look, for example, at adolescents. We did not look at the elderly. We did not look at low-income people specifically. Those would also be vulnerable groups, very worthy of consideration. But what we found is that the situation obviously becomes even worse. So these numbers are even more striking and severe. If anything, there's about half of the world's children under 5 and about two-thirds of the world's women of reproductive age that are deficient in at least one essential micronutrient. And again, the point that I'm trying to make is that obviously the majority of these concentrates in the global south. So we're talking about Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, East Asia, and the Pacific, where 3/4 of them live. But in reality, if we look at the global north, it's not like we're doing much better. For example, here I pulled out that the UK is an example, but I could talk about the US, I could talk about many other countries that were included in this assessment. And what we found is that in reality, 40% of preschool-age children in the UK and about 55% of women of reproductive age are deficient in at least one micronutrient, which is essential. This is primarily driven by iron in children, that's panel A at the top, and it's primarily driven by iron, folate, and vitamin D for women, that's panel B at the bottom. This was based, also I wanted to mention, this was based not just on dietary intake data, this was actually based on biomarker data from various nationally representative surveys around the world. So what is the role of animal source foods in all that? And why do we need to worry about animal source foods and their environmental and nutritional implications? Well, in reality, as we all know, animal source foods are rich in many of the nutrients that are commonly lacking in diets, that the previous slides clearly showcased the burden of heat and hunger. And very often they're found in more bioavailable forms as well as compared to plant source foods. So my colleague Taibio and I recently developed a new holistic, we like calling it holistic because it's very comprehensive, nutrient profiling system that allows to score foods on the basis of many dietary factors. If you're curious, I also have some extra slides on that. We submitted it to Nature Communications and it's currently under review. And when we looked at a set of, in reality, we analyzed over 1,500 foods. Here I'm showing a sample of 400 foods for sub-Saharan Africa. When we looked at these foods organized in commonly consumed food groups, what we noticed is that animal source foods consistently show at the top in terms of nutrient density, nutritional value. They're always on the, let's say, right side of the scale, apart from obviously the ultra-processed meat and ultra-processed cheese, etc. So who's really consuming animal source foods, and why do we see so many deficiencies if we all eat large amounts of animal source foods globally, and if they're so nutrient dense and so good for us? Well, in reality, we're not all consuming animal source foods. There's some regions in the world that are consuming way too many, and there's other regions that are consuming way too few. The distribution of animal source foods intake is very uneven globally. So what you can see is that Central or Eastern Europe and Central Asia are clearly out of scale. We're consuming way too much. We're talking about 6 servings of animal source foods per day in Russia. We're talking about 4 servings of animal source foods per day in the UK. That's definitely excessive. But at the other end of the spectrum, instead, we observe, for example, South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa and other regions of the world where actually consumption is currently very low and does not even reach 1 serving per day. The serving is different depending on the types of animal source foods that you're looking at. Again, if you're curious to know more, I'm happy to talk about this study afterwards. But basically, the point here is that the distribution of consumption is really uneven across regions, so the importance of context-specific and tailored solution comes out. Why is this whole discussion about animal source foods, plant-based diets relevant for micronutrient deficiencies and inadequacies? Well, there's actually mounting evidence on the potential risks for nutrient adequacy of plant-based, or primarily plant-based, I should be more precise, diets. So this is a recent systematic review, very thorough, that was conducted by Leonard and other authors, was published last year, so very recent. And they looked at several nutritional assessments of different types of primarily plant-based diets around the globe. And what they found is that when you switch from current diets, baseline diets, or omnivorous diets to primarily plant-based diets, there's actually risks of inadequacies for many nutrients of global health concern. For some of them, the evidence is really mixed. In the case of vitamin A, it's in 4 cases neutral effect. In 4 cases, it was a significant decrease. But for others, the evidence is actually quite clear. And that's the case for zinc, calcium, vitamin B12, and vitamin D, where we see a consistent reduction across studies. The case of iron is quite interesting, and I wanted to point that out. As you can see, in most studies, actually what they found is a significant increase in iron intake, and that's because it was not based on iron status or biomarkers of iron status, but rather just on intake. So examining dietary patterns and combining them with food composition data. I got told that I need to speed up, so I'll try to speed up. I'll touch very briefly upon this. This is a study that we conducted a couple years back with my colleague Tai Bio and Jessica Fanzo. This was published in the Lancet Planetary Health, so you can go and check it out if you're curious. What we did was we reassessed the Lancet Planetary Health diet for adequacy in 6 priority micronutrients, and we actually found that it falls short in several of them, and especially iron, and especially for women of reproductive age. Our assessment was conducted separately for adults, so the general population, as well as women of reproductive age specifically, and we accounted for bioavailability of vitamin A, folate, iron, and zinc. If you're curious about what we did different from the original assessment of nutrient adequacy of the Lancet report, obviously I'm happy to answer questions on that as well. I don't have time now, so I'm gonna speed a little bit. So finally, how does this whole discussion translate into policy and practice? As you can see, we talked about a lot of trade-offs, we talked about a lot of global challenges. How do we address them all together without losing from any side? Well, there's no one answer. Unfortunately, I wish there was. Basically, to sum it up, micronutrient deficiencies and inadequacies are widespread, not just in the global south, as some of us may think, but actually also in the global north, as the maps and studies that I've shown demonstrate. Unfortunately, switching to plant-based diets does carry a risk for exacerbating some of those inadequacies, especially in vulnerable countries and population groups. There's another issue that has not been mentioned yet today, which I'm happy also to discuss afterwards, but crop mass production systems, as well as climate change, are actually decreasing the nutrient density of crops. And especially staple crops like maize and wheat and rice that form the basis of diets for so many populations globally. So when shifting to plant-based diets, we also need to think about that. Given that crops are going to be less nutrient dense in the future, what will happen to many populations that have, for example, poor diets, not very diverse, and that primarily rely on staple crops that are decreasing in nutrient density. So the message that I would like to leave you with is that there's no one-size-fits-all solution. We need to look at a plethora, at a bundle of solutions and strategies available. I've listed the 4 principal ones here. Dietary change is not enough in and of itself. We need to also combine it with fortification, supplementation, biofortification, and there may be other solutions that are proven and evidence-based that I haven't listed here. And when we talk about a reduction of animal source foods, we need to be a little bit more nuanced. There are some areas of the world where we're consuming way too much. And yes, we definitely do need to reduce them, the UK and Russia being 2 of the primary examples. But there's also other areas in the world where people are under-consuming animal source foods. And we need to allow for increased intake of those populations to fill nutrient gaps. Final message, whenever we design strategies, policies, actions, interventions, we need to think of the big 4, not just nutrition and environment, but also cultural acceptability and affordability. I just gave the example of Tanzania, where I was recently with some of my colleagues traveling to villages and asking people, would you conceive a diet where you're not eating chicken, or where you're not eating beef, or where you're not eating eggs? And the answer was consistently no. So cultural acceptability is very important, especially for animal source foods that are deeply rooted in cultural traditions in many countries globally. And affordability. Again, some of the large-scale modeling studies showcase that, yes, there can be cost savings in the global north, but there may actually be increases in costs in the global south. Thank you, and happy to take your questions after.